In a recent episode of the Citizen of Heaven podcast, we discussed the concept of identity. And in that context, we discussed in brief the transfiguration of Jesus and how, for a brief shining moment, pardon the expression, we saw Jesus for just about as close to as he is as would be possible in the flesh, or at least Peter, James, and John did, along with Moses and Elijah on that particular occasion. And we discussed in brief, at least, how that prefigures our own transfiguration, if you will. I'd like to embellish on that a little bit here today. I'd like to start by reading from Luke's account of the transfiguration in Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 28. About 8 days after these sayings, he took along Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And when he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who were standing with him. And as these two men were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here, and let's make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not realizing what he was saying. But while he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And then a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. Of course, Peter did report by inspiration later on in his epistle, a brief account at least of this occasion. I can't imagine they possibly could have kept their mouths shut forever on such an amazing occurrence. And what the Transfiguration tells us, among other things, is that we see Jesus and we see God. This great expression given to us in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and chapter 4 rather, in verse 6, "For God who said light shall shine out of darkness is the one who is shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." The word light comes up here again, and many times. John chapter 1 is another example where Jesus is seen as light, a light that necessarily by his nature invades darkness, banishes darkness. You cannot have him and darkness in the same place. This is who Jesus is. And so it's not surprising that the light imagery and even physical light should be seen in the presence of Jesus as we read the context. We become light ourselves. We are the light of the world, he says of us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 through 16. This light is intended to be shown, and we shine that light when we acquire the appearance of Jesus. And it's noteworthy here in this particular occasion, I think, that Moses and Elijah, of all people, appear to him and have this conversation. And Jesus is distinguished from Moses and Elijah, or Moses and the prophets, if you will. Oftentimes Elijah is seen as representative of the prophet class. So whether it is they were such remarkable luminaries that they are, there's another light imagery for you, they're luminaries, that they are so remarkable that they were permitted this conversation, whether they were just that much more impressive to Peter, John, and James, and to us as well as we see this, or whether it's a fulfillment of the basic concept of Moses and the prophets speaking about the Christ over the centuries. Luke chapter 16 mentions this phrase a couple of times, that Moses and the prophets had been spoken to the people from early times, from Moses' times, obviously, and even to a certain degree even before that the kingdom had always been preached. People had not always understood what the kingdom was or who the king was going to be, or even if there was going to be a king. But by the time the first century had come along, the idea of a Messiah, the idea of a kingdom, had taken root in the consciousness of the people, and they were ready for it. There were signs in the Old Testament that seemed to be pointing to that day as the time when these things would be accomplished. And Jesus says of that time that ever since then, people have been trying to push their way into it. People have been trying to acquire this kingdom almost by force, the text seems to indicate. And that seems to follow along the lines of many of the criticisms Jesus has of the leaders of his day who wanted to claim the kingdom. In fact, several of the parables, the parable of the minas, for instance, people have temporary custody of some part of this inheritance, and they are determined to get rid of the proper heir and claim the inheritance for themselves. This claiming of the kingdom, as presumptuous as it seems, as ridiculous as it seems, is still going on today when people continue to reject what Moses and the prophets and what Jesus Christ himself had said about the kingdom. We may not properly understand it, but that's because we didn't listen to the Lord. And if we did not listen to the Lord, then we were not going to find this kingdom. We cannot get to where Jesus wants us to be if we ignore what Jesus and the others say about themselves. Later on in Luke chapter 16 and verse number 29, in that story about the rich man and Lazarus, the rich man begs Abraham to send Lazarus back to his family because he doesn't want them to come to where he is in the state of torment. Presumably, he thinks that they're living the same kind of lifestyle. They're doing the same things, ignoring the same things. They're going to wind up in the same place. And Abraham says they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. It is adequate for us, and even more so in the New Testament time, when we have Moses and the prophets and we have the apostles and other inspired New Testament writers. We can listen to what is said about Jesus. We can internalize it, we can accept it by faith, and we can put it to work in our lives. If we are not willing to do that, if we're not willing to find faith in the gospel, faith in the words of God, that's where the text says it comes from. Romans chapter 10, verse 17, faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of Christ. If we're not willing to do that, Abraham says on that occasion they wouldn't believe that someone came back from the dead, which is, I think, where the name Lazarus comes from, by the way. Jesus knows at this point that a man named Lazarus is, in fact, going to come back from the dead and is going to testify to the power of the resurrection and the power of Jesus Christ himself, and people are still going to reject Jesus. In fact, in John chapter 12, just a few verses after the raising of Lazarus, we find that they're plotting to send Lazarus back where he came from. And that's to say nothing about Jesus himself and his own resurrection, of course, which was vehemently denied because it proved the exact point that Jesus was trying to prove all these months and years that the apostles themselves didn't fully believe until the end, until it was revealed in the Holy Spirit. We can be recipients of that if we are willing to do so. If we're willing to open our ears, open our minds to the truth of the gospel, we can see the transfigured Christ. We can see him for who he truly was and who he truly is. And believing that, we can begin the process of transfiguring ourselves, or allowing him to transfigure us would be a better way of phrasing it probably. If we listen to what he has to say, if we make ourselves a living sacrifice, as Paul says in Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, if we give ourselves completely, he can start remaking us from the inside out, from our mind out to our behaviors. We can become different kind of people, more like him every single day. We'll take backward steps from time to time because we're not as perfect as he was. But he's making us perfect after a fashion. He is honing our skills. He is honing our values so that we become more and more like he would want us to be. Hopefully, at least, that's what's happening. And if it's not happening, then it's because we have not given ourselves to this process as completely as he gave himself to the process. He was willing to go to the cross to fulfill his end of this bargain. Are we willing to pick up our own cross and follow after him to fulfill our part of the bargain? That is the real question. Now, I'd like to follow up on this a little bit and talk about what this transfigured life looks like in brief. When we as Christians give ourselves over to Jesus, what starts happening in us? Perhaps most fundamentally, we see that our alliance, our allegiance is going to change. We are no longer our own people. We are no longer following after some party or some group or some figurehead. We are following after Jesus. Paul begs the Corinthians in the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 and following, that they all speak the same thing, that they not divide along party lines. They not be Paulites or Apollosites or Peterites or any such thing as that, but rather that they trust in Jesus alone as the power of salvation, Jesus alone who died for their sins. He's grateful, in fact, that he didn't have more of a hand in baptizing more Corinthian Christians there. Presumably that would have given more credence to the idea of a Paul party there in Corinth. He says, no, absolutely not. By the way, he's not minimizing the importance of baptism there. He's minimizing the importance of Paul in that occasion. He was sent not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. And that's what we are sent to do. We're sent to preach the gospel. And when people submit to that gospel, regardless of who's carrying it, regardless of what particular process brought them to the threshold of glory, as they receive the gospel, Jesus begins this process. And it begins here by accepting him as king, accepting him as Lord. And what do we think that means, by the way? Do we think that being king of our lives, as we oftentimes sing in our hymns, that we can do whatever we feel like doing and kind of sing these songs on the Lord's Day, and that makes it okay? That we can sin the more that grace may increase, to use the phrase from Romans chapter 6, verse 1. Far be it from us, as he says there in verse number 2. How can we who died to sin live any longer therein? We are committed to Jesus now. And whatever kind of allegiance, whatever kind of alliance we may have had in times past with people, with parties, with groups, with tribes, with nations, all of that fades into the background now because Jesus is now our king, the King of kings. No matter what other king you submit to in this life, he must have the prominence, he must have the preeminence in everything. We also see that our conversation is going to change. We're going to talk about different things. We're going to talk about them in different ways. We're going to sound different in the way that we speak. In the most obvious of senses, we're going to avoid vulgarity. We're going to avoid any kind of crude conversation or inappropriate language. But it's really much more than that. It's about talking about different kinds of things. In times past, we talked about what we liked, what we preferred. We talked about the weather. We talked about the football game. We talked about whatever it happens to be, which is fine as far as that goes. But when we come to Jesus, we find our conversation changing. We find ourselves talking about different kinds of things more and more as Jesus occupies our space. You all know people who are caught up in causes. Maybe it's a political thing. Maybe it's a social thing. Maybe it's their job. Whatever it happens to be, a hobby maybe. And that's all they ever want to talk about. And it drives you crazy because you don't necessarily share that kind of passion with them. We need to understand that's how we sound to people out there in the world, or we should sound that way at least, because we are obsessed with Jesus and we find him on our tongue at all times. In Mark chapter 9, there's an interesting conversation that's given to us starting verse number 33. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he began to question them, as he questioned the apostles. What were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had discussed with one another which of them was the greatest. And sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, if anyone wants to be first, he should be the last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and placed him among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me does not receive me, but him who sent me. What he's saying here is that these old conversations that you were involved with are beneath you now. They're beneath your dignity as a Christian. It used to be all about ourselves. How can we make our way? How can we become important? How can we become rich? How can we become popular? It's all about becoming the vice president in the kingdom. When we take this old attitude into this new relationship, Jesus says you're going to have to scrap that. This is not about becoming the greatest kingdom citizen ever. This is about serving. This is about giving of yourself, not asking other people to give to you. This self-serving kind of attitude that we may have had in times past to tell people how smart we were, how well-informed we were, how popular we were, whatever kind of conversation we might have had, whether it's name dropping or whether it's using big, huge words or whatever it happens to be, that we were using our conversation to exalt ourselves, to show people how important, how good we are. We're over that now, or we should be. We start trying to get over that. Everything that we say now reflects Jesus. Everything that we say now glorifies Jesus. That's what we're all about now. Our faith is also going to change, hopefully for the better. It doesn't always change for the better. Sometimes it changes for the worse. But when we give ourselves to Jesus properly, when we are truly devoting ourselves to him, we make a perhaps raggedy but generally upward climb, growing and stronger in our faith, in our demonstration of faith. The apostles are great examples of this. They were not always on an upward slope. Sometimes it feels like they were on a downward slope, but Jesus had confidence in them. We need to have confidence in ourselves as well, that this process will work in us if we commit to it. The apostles, when it came down to it, they wanted to be servants of Christ. They wanted to be citizens of the kingdom. And Jesus was able to work with that. We sometimes wonder how he could have picked such a ragtag group of miscreants to do his work. Well, that kind of proves the point, doesn't it? That Jesus doesn't need perfect people. He needs people who are willing to change, people who are willing to learn, people who are willing to grow. And that's what we see, again, in a bit of a ragged sense, but we see this process working in the lives of the apostles. In Luke chapter 9, after the transfiguration conversation there, on the next day, verse number 37, they came down from the mountain. A large crowd met him, and a man from the crowd shouted, saying, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, because he's my only son." And the spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams and throws him into convulsion with foaming at the mouth. And only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, and they could not. And Jesus answered and said, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long will I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." And I'm not sure that he's criticizing the man here or the son. I think what he's doing is criticizing his own disciples, saying, I'm trying to be patient with you here, but you're not making it easy on me. The point is that they should have had enough faith to cast this demon out, and they did not because of the smallness of their faith. That's why they were not able to do this. Later on, verse 46, yet again, we have the same conversation coming up about who's going to be greatest. And Jesus knows what they were thinking. Verse 47 takes a child by it and brings him to his side. This is the one who's going to be a citizen of the kingdom. The one who is least is the one who I make great. The one who is great is going to become least. It's not about inspiring people to trust in us. It's not about building up our own brand in the gospel. It's about allowing him to grow us, to help us to mature in our relationship with him. Later on, verse 49, John answered and said, "Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow along with us. He wasn't one of our friends." Well, he wouldn't have had the power if he hadn't gotten it from God. And I think that's the point Jesus is making here. Jesus has disciples that were not necessarily in that one little company. This is not about making sure that John and his buddies had a monopoly on the casting out of demons, which, by the way, they were not very good at, not as good as they should have been. We just saw that a few verses prior. It's not about ourselves, it's about him. Hopefully, we can get to the point where we can properly show this faith. It seems like the disciples are going kind of the wrong direction. There's another story given to us right after this where they are denied entrance into the town of Samaria, into one of the towns of Samaria, and James and John, Boanerges, the sons of thunder, they want to call down fire from heaven to destroy this town. We're going to kill lots of innocent civilians just because they hurt our feelings, because they weren't what we wanted them to be. That's not the gesture of faith. That's not the gesture of the kind of growth that Jesus is trying to inspire in us. Now, hopefully, we can overcome these setbacks. We can grow our faith. And if it can work with these disciples, if it can work for James and John and the rest of these, if they can become powerful servants of the kingdom for decades after these events here, then surely Jesus can work the same kind of thing in us also. This is the power that Jesus has. It's not about our power, it's about his power and how he is able to transform us, to change our appearance, to bring light to our lives, light that was not internal to us, that was external to us, that transforms everything about us, the way we look, the way that we sound, the way that we behave. All of these things change because Jesus has come into our life. And it all begins when we change that first thing, when we change our name, or when God changes our name, might be a better way of phrasing it. The name of Jesus that we wear. When we call ourselves Christians, we glorify God in that name. The text says in 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 16, when we choose to give up our old identity and accept the identity of Jesus Christ, we are leaving one family and joining another family. This is what happens when a daughter leaves the house, when the daughter chooses to be a part of a new family. She traditionally in our culture has given up her last name, the name that she received from her original father. She adopts a new name of her husband and his family. She is attaching herself to that family. And that's how she's going to be known from this point forward. That's an indication of what we do as the people of God, as the bride of Christ, using the analogy from Ephesians chapter 5. When we come to Jesus and accept him as our Lord and Savior, our spiritual husband, as it were, we change the way we used to be. We reject that old lifestyle. We cleave to our spiritual husband and allow him to guide us and shepherd us and provide for us and guide us in the way that we should go, trusting that he has our back, that he is wiser than we are, that he is an appropriate leader for our lives. That's not an easy transition to make by any stretch of the imagination. It is extraordinarily difficult for many of us. For all of us, it's difficult at times. But if we find our strength in Jesus, if we build our faith, if we build our confidence, if we read more and more about who he is and what he does and how he carried himself, we have confidence that this holy, righteous, humble servant, the Son of God, that he is more than capable of directing our lives from this point forward. And being changed into his image is the only thing, in fact, that we want from our lives. I hope and pray that this is reflective of God's will for us and that you're going to be able to implement it in your life and grow in your faith so we can all become more like Jesus. Thank you very much for listening. God bless.